You've identified as a Christian nationalist. There's a lot of talk about Christian nationalism now. Do you feel like that's something that they're going to be making a big part of this campaign?
TYT caught up with Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene in South Carolina ahead of the primary in that state. And what does she think about more members of the far right feeling comfortable enough to publicly call for a Christian nationalist country? Well, let's hear what she had to say.
Are you aware that the founding fathers were Christians and nationalists? I mean, I don't know why you think that's such a bad thing. Of course, I'm a proud Christian, and of course, I love my country.
Thanks so much.
Yep,
have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Now, what I thought was really interesting about that answer was the fact that she got super defensive right away. Michael Schor asked her the most neutral question. He didn't indicate that he finds it to be a bad thing. I'm sure he does find it to be a bad thing, but you wouldn't know it based on the way that he asked the question. He was very polite, and there was no indication that he was being judgmental about how she identifies herself. But she's wrong about the founding of the country. We'll get to that in just a moment, but Cenk, do you want to jump in first?
We might have millions of people watching this show, but you can be the difference maker because we just need 1% of our audience to be paid members, and then this show can be around forever. So you can make that difference. Click join now. We're going to talk about whether the founding fathers were Christians in the way that Marjorie Taylor Greene says and thought that we should have a Christian country. They most certainly did not. First of all, it's in the Constitution. They said we can't establish a religion. I don't know how much clearer it has to be. But for Marjorie Taylor Greene, it's never going to get through her enormously thick skull, right? But I do want to focus 1 second before we turn to that on the nationalist part. She's like, the founding fathers were nationalists. Well, kind of. Remember, the nation that they started in was the British Empire. So they actually were not nationalists for the British Empire. They rebelled against the government that they were under. And then they formed a new nation called America. So actually, they really weren't nationalists. They were the opposite. They were rebels who overthrew the country that they were in and started a whole new country. But expecting Marjorie Taylor Greene to know anything is apparently way too much to ask for.
So let's look into our founding fathers and also just the founding of the country. Now, the Library of Congress had some interesting information that maybe Marjorie Greene can take some time to read about. The Virginia Ratifying Convention and James Madison's constituents, among whom were large numbers of Baptists who wanted freedom of religion secured, expected him to push for a Bill of Rights. On September 28th, 1789, both houses of Congress voted to send 12 amendments to the states. In December of 1791, those ratified by the requisite 3/4 of the states became the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Religion was addressed in the First Amendment in the following familiar words, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In notes for his June 8th, 1789 speech, introducing the Bill of Rights, Madison indicated his opposition to a national religion. That's weird.
That seems to be the exact opposite of what Marjorie Taylor Greene said. And Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He also wrote the Virginia Constitution, which James Madison modeled the US Constitution after. So if anyone would know why this country was founded, it's Thomas Jefferson. By the way, Jefferson also had a Jefferson Bible, where he would ripped out the majority of the pages in the Bible.
The supernatural stuff and the stuff about miracles.
Yeah, because he thought it was nonsense. And he kept a much smaller version of the positive things in the Bible. Doesn't seem like the kind of guy who thought that, oh boy, we've got to protect the Bible as he's ripping pages out of it. And then we have to base the whole country on it. Besides which, I don't think she can read. And that applies to all of you Christian nationalists if you're watching out there. Can you understand words like we shall not establish a religion? Not that complicated.
So I want to read some of what, since you mentioned Jefferson, what Jefferson had to say about religion and the mixing of religion and the country. Let's go to graphic 8 here, where he said in 1799 to a letter to Elbridge Gerry, I should say, I am for freedom of religion and against all maneuvers to bring about a legal ascendancy of one sect over another. He also said this: the clergy, by getting themselves established by law and engrafted into the machine of government, have been a very formidable engine against the civil and religious rights of man.
I want to say two things about that. So guys, this is almost exactly what I said on the show at the end of last week. One of the problems with establishing religion is it kills religion, because you have to pick one leader who is the theocrat who decides which direction you're going to go, whichever sect he's in. But then that discriminates against all other forms of Christianity, let alone Judaism and Islam and Hinduism and atheism, etc. But okay, let's say we pick a Lutheran. Then what are the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Southern Baptists gonna do? You pick a Southern Baptist, does that mean every other interpretation of the religion is now thrown out because we're now a Christian country that is a Southern Baptist country, right? So how do you know which one? And by the way, when they disagree, do you go with the Presbyterians or the Southern Baptists? Even if you didn't have one theocratic leader. That's why Jefferson and Madison were like, are you guys nuts? In order to protect religion, we have to make sure that we are not a religious country. We are not a country ruled by one religion. Again, with Madison saying we shall not have a national religion, and Jefferson saying what he's saying, those are the Declaration of Independence, Constitution. What else do you need as evidence?
Okay,
they don't care about it.
More. Let's go to graphic 10. This is more from Jefferson. This was a letter to Samuel Miller in 1808. I consider the government of the United States as interdicted by the Constitution from intermeddling in religious institutions, their doctrines, discipline, or exercises. Like, he's just very clear about the need for separation of church and state. Our very first president, George Washington, was also very clear on that. I have a few quotes from him that I wanted to read. Let's go to the graphic 4, in which Washington was writing to an Irish politician by the name of Edward Newenham. Edward Newenham had written a letter to George Washington lamenting the conflicts between Catholics and Protestants in his country. And in response, Washington said this: of all the animosities which have existed among mankind, those which are caused by a difference of sentiments in religion appear to be the most inveterate and distressing, and ought most to be deprecated. He also said, I was in hopes that the enlightened and liberal policy which marked the present age would at least have reconciled Christians of every denomination so far as we should never again see religious disputes carried to such a pitch as to endanger the peace of society. So he saw those religious battles as endangering the peace of society. Here's more from him. When the clergy complained that the Constitution lacked mention of Jesus Christ in 1789, here's what Washington said in response: I am persuaded you will permit me to observe that the path of true piety is so plain as to require but little political direction. To this consideration, we ought to ascribe the absence of any regulation respecting religion from the Magna Carta to our country.
Of our country.
Of our country, my bad.
Yes.
So he, again, very clear. But this is stuff that, I mean, you would expect a United States congresswoman or congressperson to know. After all, they are working on behalf of the American people within the American government. Not knowing the history of this country or how it was founded, why it was founded, it's look, concerning to say the least. And I would venture to say that Marjorie Greene isn't the only person who is just uninformed about what our country is really about and why it was founded, how it was founded.
Look, you go deeper into this and you'll see a lot of the founding fathers were deists.
Yes.
They believed in a God, but they did not believe in Christianity. And you think they set up a Christian nation that they themselves didn't even believe in? That doesn't make any sense at all. Lastly, what are all these guys, Washington, Jefferson, et cetera, talking about all this religious strife? Remember, they came from Europe originally. And in Europe, either a state would be declared Protestant or Catholic. And then they would oppress the other sect, right? They would oppress the Protestants if they were Catholic, vice versa. And then the countries would go to war against each other. And then they would go to war within themselves, as England did many times, switching between Protestant and Catholic. So they're like, we're not gonna do that. We're not going to declare a state religion. Instead, we're going to say no establishment of a religion. We're a secular country. We do it based on laws and the government and the consent of the governed. We do not base it on some mythological character. I'm sorry, a deity, whether you believe it or not.
But more importantly, the way that they established the country was meant to ensure religious freedom. The ability to be a person of faith who believes in whatever religion you want to believe in, which I think is part of what makes the country and the Constitution so wonderful.
And guys, last thing here, you can tell that establishing a religion is a super bad idea the minute you put another religion that's not your own in that sentence.
Right.
So shall we establish Islam as the religion of America? Of course not, that's ridiculous. So, but when you put in Christianity, it is equally ridiculous. What happens to all the people who are not Christian, let alone the sects of Christianity? So are we supposed to tell the Jews, that's it, you live in a Christian nation and there's nothing you could do about it? No, of course not, because this is America. That's the whole point of this country, that we come from all over the world and we unite here. We are the United States of America. And the only way you can do that is if you don't pick one religion to rule the rest.